held in Cape Town in 2019, we were pleasantly surprised by the level of interest. Well, over the past couple of years, that interest in fuel cells and hydrogen has grown much further, and that's on the back of the global decarbonization drive. Over this time, there's also been great advances in the commercialization of these technologies, including advances in the manufacturing of green hydrogen. Now, these developments could see fuel cells and hydrogen play an important role in the future energy mix and transport mix as the world moves to a low carbon and decarbonization world. Exactly what role hydrogen and fuel cells will play in this future mix remains to be seen. And we will discuss some of that today. But these developments, as well as other technologies in this space, holds both challenges and opportunities for the PGM sector, as well as for South Africa's emerging hydrogen industries. First off, we will be going to Professor David Hart. Dr. David Hart is a director at E4 Tech, a specialist sustainability consultancy. He's also a visiting professor at Imperial College London's Centre for Environmental Policy.
Despite all of the difficulties in 2020, there was still an increase in fuel cell shipments that took place. So we collect data from all of the companies in the fuel cell industry, or at least we contact all of them, and the vast majority are happy to share with us. And so these are primary research figures which we have gathered and put together. We have to anonymise them, so unfortunately we're not allowed to tell you very much of what lies behind this. But we cut them in three different ways. So this is one of three graphs which I'll show you. This first slide is about shipments by application and megawatts by application. As always, we do this for two reasons. The shipments gives you the number of units, and sometimes that can be dominated by very, very small units for portable power, for those kind of things. The megawatts is what drives cost in the industry, what drives the supply chain in the industry. So that's why we show it two ways. And you can see they're very different. So whereas there are quite a lot of portable shipments, they account for almost none of the power, which is logical. They're very small. They're in the hundreds of watts, even the tens of watts of unit size. There are two or three things that I want to pull out of this, though. Very sort of stark, not very exciting figures on the face of it. But you see they're rising. We had hoped, we had anticipated that the 2020 figures might even be double the 2019 figures. We had seen indications of policy support, of ramp up in manufacturing that would be appropriate to have that doubling of output. Very unfortunately, of course, COVID had a significant impact. It had a significant impact on supply chains. So factories were running at partial capacity. It was difficult to find people. It was difficult to do shipments. So a lot of orders were set back. And of course, more generally, there was less economic activity in certain sectors. So there was a pullback. But still, we saw more shipments. Two things to pull out here. The transport units are the ones which dominate power. The Toyota Mirai, which is part of this shipment category. The Hyundai Nexo is another very important part of that. And that is really valuable because that drives this supply chain cost. So the automotive manufacturers are the ones that put together the supply chains. They are the ones who know how to drive cost out of processes. On the stationary side, we see a lot more units, as you'll see on the left-hand chart, but comparatively little power reflected in those numbers of units. That's because 350,000 cumulatively of those units, so about 45,000, 50,000 last year, were 1 kilowatt units which went into Japanese apartment buildings. So it's a very established market. It's about 50,000 a year. It's something which is economically competitive. It's not cheap, but it's something which works in the Japanese context. The light duty area, which is actually where most of the power is, so the Hyundai Nexo and the Toyota Mirai, which are on the right-hand side of this chart, they're each roughly 100 kilowatts of fuel cell, and there are multiple thousands of those units being shipped every year, and that is ramping up. Those are the ones which dominate the power in the chart that you just saw. But actually, what we're seeing is a change in emphasis away from light duty and more towards heavy duty and towards other applications of fuel cells. That doesn't mean by any means that it's going away. So I've just put up a few examples. The BMW iHydrogen Next should be out next year. The Stellantis van has been announced for later this year. These are fuel cell solutions to, as you see, slightly heavier duty, light duty vehicles. So the SUV category is one which is hard to electrify. It requires heavy batteries. There are heavy vehicles to start with. So there is a grey area where batteries are not an easy solution to decarbonisation of transport. And even JLR, which has been not very bullish about fuel cells in the past, has also announced a fuel cell Range Rover that is going to be testing in the coming months. So there is a movement in light duty vehicles still, but it's not as pronounced as it has been in the past. What's really interesting is in heavy duty. And here I've categorized it in two ways. One is in buses and one is for larger trucks. So buses have been a market that's been established for a number of years and are gradually coming into real commercial activity. So you see in the chart on the left, you see the bus projects that are already operating, the different cities that have had buses for a long period of time, some of them back 20 years or so, and cities which are joining this move. And this is driven by regulation. It's particularly driven by air quality regulation. Cities are saying we cannot afford to have diesel buses on our roads. We need zero emissions. That will be a mixture of battery and hydrogen. And costs, again, coming down, very competitive with existing buses, with battery buses, with hybrid buses. So that's almost, not quite, but it's almost an established market. And there are players in there which are becoming more and more well embedded, shall we say. What's exciting is on the heavy duty side, and this 2 years ago was something which people said, this is really very unlikely, it's very difficult, you need very long duty cycles, you need 50,000 hours of use from a fuel cell to make this work. And then there was a recasting of the problem as we have to have net zero, we have to reduce CO2, we can't do it with electrification and batteries, we have to use hydrogen and fuel cells. And that has spurred an enormous amount of innovation in the sector. It's not universal. There are one or two companies like Scania who have said we think we can do it with batteries. But broadly speaking, the view is that fuel cells are the better option. So the bottom left is a picture of a fuel cell truck which is running in my neck of the woods. So I'm based in Switzerland. I have actually seen some of these Hyundai fuel cell trucks on the road near me. So this is something, I think there are 46 out running now. There are going to be 1,600 over the coming 2 or 3 years. We've seen Toyota with Hino announce and start to release its various developments. A very exciting joint venture between Daimler and Volvo called Cellcentric, which is looking at putting liquid hydrogen into trucks because that way you get better range, you get better storage capacity. But that builds on 30 years of fuel cell development at Daimler, which was originally for their light duty vehicle platform and has now shifted to be heavy duty. And you have upstarts. So Hyzon Motors, many of you may have seen the announcement last year, I think actually early this year, where Hyzon Motors, through a SPAC, raised roughly 2.5 billion, or at least the SPAC was valued at roughly 2.5 billion, and they raised a lot of money to commercialize this ground up fuel cell truck prospect, where they've built cells and stacks. They've got a history of doing that. They're based out of China and Singapore, and they've now moved into the downstream integration of those into trucks. And the first few trucks are just starting to be rolled out, but they have an ambitious timescale. So there's an awful lot going on, and that means that there's an awful lot going on in the supply chain as well. So you see companies like ElringKlinger, like Faurecia and Michelin, all participating in developing fuel cells and building fuel cell factories to be able to service these heavy duty options. The next slide is even heavier duty. So again, what we're seeing is applications which people had previously dismissed as too difficult, too long term, too far away, really coming into the money. And the trains that you see, the two on the bottom left, the one on the furthest bottom left is actually operating in revenue service in Germany, and there are dozens, if not hundreds, on order. And that will also be going into service in the Netherlands, in Italy, in France. There are announcements in California, the UK. Korea. So this is something which has grown really somewhat unexpectedly. But again, it's about net zero, it's about decarbonisation. On the top is more utility vehicles, so refuse disposal vehicles, council vehicles more generally. Decarbonising and improving air quality in inner cities is very important. You will all know, I'm sure, about the Anglo-Ballard mining truck tie-ups, but of course there are others, and there is a lot of interest from the mining industry in decarbonisation, but also in reducing reliance on, for example, volatile diesel prices. So there are plans in place for people to think about how to use renewable energy in remote mine sites, not only for above ground, but also for producing hydrogen, also for below ground vehicles. So a lot going on. And then in water generally, so these two designs are for ferries, but there are inland waterway designs, there are cruise ships, at least in concept design, which would be running on fuel cells, potentially on hydrogen. Some of them may run on ammonia, some of them may run on other hydrogen-rich carriers, but there is a clear move to decarbonise and to reduce emissions more generally, and the International Maritime Organization, although it has plans in place, is under pressure to increase the speed of change in that sector. So that's what lies behind some of that first chart that I showed you. The last bit is about stationary. So stationary fuel cells have not gone away. They are an important part of that chart. I talked about the condominium, the 1 kilowatt fuel cells. You see one there which is designed specifically for multi-use dwellings. And you see an increase in the size of those fuel cells. So the fuel cell from Toshiba, they're pushing up from 1 kilowatt to 5 kilowatts and going up to 100. The 3 kilowatt fuel cell from Kyocera, that's a solid oxide fuel cell. And you can see there's a large 50 megawatt phosphoric acid fuel cell plant installed by Doosan. That's one of the biggest that runs on byproduct hydrogen. Phosphoric acid fuel cells use a lot of platinum. That's always an interesting part of the discussion that we have during these NetBank sessions. And so some stationary fuel cells will continue to be rolled out. The market will continue to increase. We'll see what the dynamics of that look like. And I want to use that to segue onto my next slide, which is about the shipments by fuel cell type. So this may be a little bit esoteric. It's all acronyms, I'm very sorry, but these are all different types of fuel cells. Solid oxide fuel cells, PEM fuel cells, those are the ones that go into cars. Molten carbonate fuel cells. They all have different operating temperatures, they operate on different fuels. Hydrogen is something which is common to most of them, but some of them can operate directly on biogas, natural gas, other areas. You can see the dominant fuel cell at the moment is PEM. That's really because of the transport opportunity, and that will only continue to grow. But solid oxide is a very strong contender for stationary applications and for some of the bigger transport applications such as shipping. So we will see more in that area. And I think PEM and SOFC will be the ongoing main players, though we will continue to see one or two others. Alkaline fuel cells and phosphoric acid and molten carbonate will all be there somewhere in the mix, but at much smaller levels.
We will now move to Gary Kendall, who will give us a few views on the role of hydrogen in the net zero economy.
I'm really talking about the role of hydrogen in the net zero economy, not specifically the role of hydrogen fuel cells. This is the challenge ahead. This is the decarbonisation imperative. And you can see here historical emissions over the last 60 years or so, and then the forward trajectories for the Paris Agreement. So the most stringent interpretation of Paris is 1.5 degrees. You can see the decarbonisation trajectory there is astonishingly steep. And that's because we've been delaying for the longest time. If we started in 2000, we would have needed to decline emissions at a rate of about 1 to 2% a year, but we didn't. We continued to grow emissions, and so now the decline rate is more like 7 to 8% a year. The red line shows you the sort of the outer limits of the 2 degree threshold, beyond which we may trigger irreversible tipping points. And that's important to keep in mind, that this is not in any sense a utopian future. This is a future that is going to be very difficult, very challenging. And even at 2 degrees, the climate change that we experience may indeed be catastrophic for many people, if not for all of us. So, if you like, the Paris Agreement involves sort of threading this corridor, this red shaded area. And you can see, I mean, we use the word unprecedented a little bit too frequently, but you can see it's absolutely unprecedented. We've never reduced emissions for more than a year or two, and that's normally been associated with economic dislocation, such as the last 12 to 18 months. And we can't do this. We can't achieve this trajectory by disaster. We have to do it by design. And since the energy sector is by far the easiest to abate, it must be absolute zero by 2050. So all this talk about net zero, the net is for residual emissions from hard to abate sectors. The net is not for us to continue burning fossil fuels in energy applications for where an alternative exists. So 3 main buckets of intervention. One is we have to ruthlessly eliminate wasteful energy consumption. We have to, that's the first bucket. The second bucket is that to the extent that we enjoy energy services, we have to pursue really hard progress on energy efficiency, both on the supply side and the demand side. And then, of course, we have to fully decarbonise the energy system. So we have to eliminate fully the coal and the oil and the gas and replace them with renewable energy resources, primarily wind and solar. So this requires, as I said, to meet the Paris objectives is really a net zero economy by the middle of the century. That's achieved when sources of emissions and removals by sinks balance to zero. Some emission sources are comparatively easy to abate, both through behavioural changes, as I've alluded already, and through existing affordable technologies. And other emission sources might be hard to abate because the prospects for behavioural change are difficult and technologies are either expensive or non-existent. And that includes things like fertiliser, steel, cement, aviation and shipping. Now, for whatever sector we're looking at, the first most important thing we have to do is identify the most simple, cost-effective and efficient pathway to reach zero, and to pursue those pathways aggressively to get to absolute zero by 2050. And then, as I said, the residual emissions, what's left over that we can't figure out how to do, that's where we have to start invoking magical thinking and things like direct air capture, CCS and nature-based sinks. Now, remember, of course, this net zero condition by 2050, we've likely overshot the carbon budget already because of the inertia in the system. Net zero is a fleeting moment in time towards absolute negative emissions. So the period of the second half of this century from 2050 to 2100, cumulative emissions will need to be negative to approximately the same extent that we're currently emitting. So where does hydrogen fit into all this? So firstly, you'll often hear that hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, and so what's not to like? Well, firstly, it's not an energy source, it's an energy carrier. So think of it like electricity, not like coal or oil or gas. It's a carrier of energy. It's also a very important chemical feedstock, so that has non-energy uses. As I say, it's the most abundant element in the universe. This is true, but it's almost never found on Earth in its elemental form. And so arguing for hydrogen on the basis of its universal abundance is like arguing for electrons on the basis that there are a lot of electrons in the world. And it's true that we don't have a shortage of electrons in South Africa. We have a shortage of electricity. And so, as I say, the abundance of hydrogen is irrelevant because it has to first be generated. Just like electricity in processes that involve energy losses, which is important. If the primary energy source is a fossil fuel, then hydrogen emits CO2. Hydrogen today is mostly produced from fossil fuels, mostly natural gas and to a lesser extent coal, and with some additional hydrogen captured as a byproduct of other industrial processes. If the primary energy source is renewable electricity, which happens through electrolysis of water, then supply side and demand side efficiency is the critical consideration. So if we're only talking about green hydrogen, then the only thing we need to think about really is how efficiently we're delivering energy services with that green hydrogen. So today, 3/4 of industrial hydrogen is used as a chemical feedstock, not as an energy source. So it's used in crude oil refining, in the manufacture of ammonia fertilizers, and in chemical synthesis. And is currently experiencing a resurgence of interest, as you've just heard, as a potential component of the emerging zero carbon energy system. But understanding the appropriate role of hydrogen in that future energy system is crucial to avoid squandering resources. And I mean by that financial resources, attentional resources. The amount of time that we spend talking about dead ends is important, and of course natural resources too. So to give you a picture of what currently industrial hydrogen production looks like, we're producing just over 100 million tons of hydrogen a year. You can see on the left-hand side, almost all of it's coming from fossil fuels, mostly natural gas, and to a lesser extent coal, and a tiny fraction from electricity. And then on the other side, you can see where it's used. And I'll draw your attention to this. Let's see if I can get my pen working. I'll draw your attention to this one, because this is the one here where most of the conversation is dominated. And what I would ask to anyone who's proposing hydrogen as a solution for zero carbon transport is, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about all of this? So we've got to really seriously think about how and where hydrogen is going to be used. And at the moment, as you can see, this number is trivial, this number here, that approximately 100% of hydrogen supply currently is used in stationary applications, not mobile applications. So the task at hand is to eliminate emissions. And this is where emissions, CO2 emissions from fuel combustion come in the world. This is Africa, this is South Africa. So let's talk about South Africa. You can see most of the discussion so far has been about transport. So we're talking about 13% of the emissions problem in this country. Electricity and heat, we can obviously use renewable electrons there. Other energy industry, there's a slight trick of the light here because most of that is Sasol, which is mostly going into transport. So what about automotive transport? So let's have a look at the largest automotive manufacturer in the world. This is taken from Volkswagen's website. Electric battery or hydrogen, we explain where the decisive advantages of the electric drive over the fuel cell currently lie and why there is no alternative to Volkswagen's decision to consistently promote e-mobility. And the main reason is that electricity thrashes hydrogen on energy efficiency. And since energy efficiency is one of the primary considerations, given the trajectory that we have to follow, this is very important. If you're starting with renewable energy, in both cases, depicted here by a wind turbine, so we have 100 units of renewable energy in both cases, you can see that the hydrogen pathway has all of these additional losses before you actually get to the vehicle. And so you end up with only 30% of the energy from the wind turbine ending up driving the wheels. And on the battery electric pathway, you get 76% of the energy is driving the wheels. So you've got there 2.5 times greater energy efficiency on the electric pathway. So you could be forgiven for thinking, though, that there's a format war going on, right? This is another VHS Betamax story. So here's the US 10 years of sales history of electric vehicles. And so it's the two colors here are first plug-in hybrid in blue and full battery electric in green. And the plug-in hybrid, I'm sure you know, is like it's a vehicle that has a comparatively smaller battery that gives you maybe 50 kilometers of all electric range. And then it has a small generator on board that kicks in to give you a kind of range extender, whereas the battery electric vehicle takes 100% of its energy from plugging into the grid. So let's see how fuel cells are doing on the same scale in the US. So that's the format war that's going on at the moment. So the last time I looked, which was for the end of May, cumulative sales of EVs are approaching 2 million. Cumulative sales of fuel cell vehicles are just over 10,000. It's also interesting to understand the time taken to reach 10,000 units from when the first vehicle was sold. The battery electric vehicle to get to 10,000 units took 13 months. The plug-in hybrid took 16 months. The fuel cell vehicle took 109 months. Okay, so that's light-duty vehicles, but what about heavy-duty vehicles? So this was questioned in the last presentation as electricity can't do it. Well, Shenzhen in southern China, with population approaching 12 million, has a lot of buses. In fact, it has over 16,000 buses. And at the moment, every single one of them is battery electric. So what about trucks? Same story. It's been mentioned that Scania in particular believes that it's possible to electrify heavy goods vehicles. And I happen to concur with their view. So Scania sees the future very much electric. In the future, every transport can be electric. So although electrification, the shorter transports will happen first, as power infrastructure improves and batteries become more efficient, lighter, cheaper, electrified range and capability will keep extending. Oh, why the enthusiasm then for hydrogen in road transport? And this is going to sound conspiratorial, but it's not. It's about incumbency and it's about vested interests. Now, this isn't on its own a disqualifier. It's just important to understand and evaluate the arguments in favour. It's to understand where they're coming from and which interest groups are presenting those arguments. Because just because something is legal and profitable does not mean it is in the public interest. And so many of the problems of our socioeconomic system are the misalignment between the private profit motive and the general interest. The number one priority is full decarbonisation of the electricity sector with renewables, because that's the largest part of the emissions problem. And so if we're producing renewable electrons and then we're squandering it to produce green hydrogen to put into fuel cell vehicles or for anything else for that matter, while we're still using fossil fuels to generate electrons, that's actually nonsense on toast. I want to leave with the conclusion, in case anyone thinks I'm beating up on hydrogen, that I see it's going to play a very important role in the future net zero economy. It's just not the one that has captured the popular imagination. We're going to need green hydrogen for chemical feedstocks, for fertilizer, methanol, for green steel production, for zero carbon fuel in aviation, and potentially shipping. Ammonia has already been mentioned. Potentially as an energy storage medium to help us get to 100% renewable electricity grid. And remember, as I said just now, all of these options imply hydrogen hubs, not hydrogen networks. And hydrogen should not be entertained in applications where direct electrification is simpler, cheaper, and more efficient. Hydrogen from fossil fuels is incompatible with net zero. Watch out for the bait and switch. And South Africa specifically should pursue hydrogen opportunities that cohere with its net zero objective as part of a clean, affordable, safe and efficient energy system. Short term, we've got to rapidly scale up renewable and embedded energy. We've got to directly electrify the road transport system, both light and heavy duty. Medium to long term, green hydrogen for steel, fertilizer, chemicals and aviation and shipping. And the last thing, in case it hasn't been clear in my talk, is to remain alert to motivated reasoning from vested interests and incumbents who are often led to present hydrogen as a universal panacea, and it often comes along with natural gas as an imagined bridge.